Thank you all for being here. My name is Keith Morse. I'm a pediatric hospitalist here at Stanford Children's, and here with me up on stage we have Scott Edmondson, who is the Research Data Governance and Privacy Director at Stanford, as well as Jason Fries, who is a computer scientist and researcher here at Stanford. The reason we have these two here on stage with us is that they are uniquely qualified to talk about the topic of EHR data release, or publicly available data sets. Before I turn things over to them to really dive into the weeds, I want to do a little bit of level setting about what are we talking about here when we talk about publicly available data. In short, releasing data that has been anonymized essentially onto the internet for use for research and innovation by anybody. This data can be of different types. So the most common one is probably imaging data, but there's also a fair amount of EHR or longitudinal data that is made available. The most famous one of these is probably Mimic, that some of you may have heard of. Mimic is a data set that is released out of Beth Israel. It's adult data from the ICU and emergency room that's been available for since the early 2000s. And then we here at Stanford have the Stanford Amy Center, which is leading the way in terms of release of imaging data for public use. So they have currently over 20 different data sets that have been made available for public use. The question is, why would an institution go to the effort to release data? Is there a regulatory push? Is there a financial upside? No, frankly. This is something that is largely done out of consideration for the public good to support, by definition, researchers who are outside of the local community. So supporting those researchers nationally and globally. We at Stanford are blessed to have both a research community and a health system that generates data that is of interest to that research community. There are many qualified, ambitious research teams that don't have the benefit of those supporting institutions, and so potentially would be able to engage in these types of research projects if data was made publicly available. And of course, this group well knows the importance that data plays with AI, both in terms of model development and model validation. So when we think about the role that these data sets can play nationally and for pediatric use cases, these are the types of things we're thinking about. All right, Jason, I want to turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and about the work that you've done with releasing data publicly.
Thanks, Keith. Hopefully it's working. So I'm a computer scientist by training. My research interests are in the building and evaluation of healthcare foundation models. These are models trained on often very large populations of patients for purposes of encouraging desirable properties in the model that you then deploy. Things like robustness and resistant to data shifts and able to be used with much fewer examples in practice. So these are all things that are desirable in healthcare. And where this intersects with my philosophy on responsible AI is how do we reliably evaluate these models in practice? And that requires access to realistic, often longitudinal patient data. And for a very long time in this field, it is particular with EHR data, it has been extremely challenging to conduct reproducible, reliable research, where reliable here is verifiable by someone outside of your university. And because of that, we've kind of stalled a little bit in our ability to really, have a shared understanding of what state of the art is and where we need to move to make these models really impact patient lives.
All right, Scott, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and also tell us a little bit about how institutions think about sharing data?
So institutions, First of all, I am the Director of Research, Data Governance, and Privacy, and I have an institutional hat in the sense that I serve on a committee founded by Michael Halas, who is the COO of Stanford Medicine and developed principles for responsible secondary uses of data for external collaborators, and I serve on that committee. So from an institutional standpoint, we want to both enable AI, enable reproducible medicine, and validate results, and support you know, clinical trials with robust uses of data. At the same time, we also have a concurrent mandate to prevent breaches and to responsibly protect data from a privacy standpoint and from a security standpoint. So those twin goals are sometimes in tension, but they're actually complementary in the sense that in order to be a world-class leader in responsible stewardship of data, we have to do both at the same time. And I think that institutions are primarily concerned with making sure that when a patient comes into Stanford Healthcare or any kind of academic medical center, the primary concern is that you're healthcare and not necessarily making money. So what the institution does is that it creates these robust due diligence processes like the Secondary Data Use Committee and other ancillary offices to make sure that those interests are realized in an implemented way. So what's a tangible manifestation of that? So one part of the Secondary Data Use Committee is to make sure that there's a privacy review with a privacy office. There's a conflict of interest review so that if an individual is utilizing data that is in the EHR or a clinical practice, the treatment reasons are separated and the decision making that goes on for a for-profit company are separated from the clinical decision. And of course, the IRB does play that role for federally sponsored research, but there are certain gaps that the regulatory process doesn't cover. So there are many different aspects that we look at to make sure that responsible data use happens.
Thank you. Jason, this first question is for you. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about the process for releasing data publicly, and then particularly, what were the big challenges? What were the hardest steps?
So we've released 3 data sets at this point in conjunction with the Amy Center, and then through an organization called Rediviz that I'll talk about in a sec. I think the process, the determination to release it was for benchmarking. The process was made challenging just because there is, at the time, no standardized process, right? In like an idealized world, there would be a codified, waterfall of reviews and criteria that you would achieve, and then the data would pass the blessing of all, requirements to be released. But because this is such a new area, a new field with new considerations, and as Scott said, sort of things in tension, it was a lot of discovery of the right offices to speak to and the right champions for the process. And I think we've been really lucky at Stanford to find people like Scott who have helped shepherd us through all of the offices. But what I personally found most difficult was sort of all of the ways in which the process spiraled into considerations I had not thought of at the beginning. Things kind of as like pedestrian as like, where will this data live? Like, what is the security of that place it will be accessed? What is the mechanism by which you vet people that request the data? All of these have costs associated with it. They have owners, they have criteria to meet a certain bar. And so there's quite a bit of discovery to figure out, all of putting these pieces together to release data in a responsible way that really respected patient privacy and also achieved our aims in research.
Excellent. Scott, you talked a little bit about the Secondary Data Use Committee. I'm curious what types of things make institutions generally and Stanford specifically comfortable releasing data? And then in the era of AI and the enthusiasm around data for developing AI, is that making institutions more or less comfortable releasing data?
The answer is yes. So I think my presentation is really a complement to Michelle Mello's excellent presentation about the responsible deployment and development of AI. My role is about the responsible deployment and development of data in a way. So all AI really depends on data in its manifold forms. And from an institutional standpoint, as stewards of the data, the institution is both more willing to make data available for use, but at the same time, also much more protective. And so what does that mean on a practical level? Well, it means that if a company comes to Stanford and knocks on the door and says, we have this great service or product using AI, just give us your data, and in exchange, we'll give you a cut of the profits, and it'll be a win-win situation. That's actually a flat no, because it's solely based on the for-profit motive. And Stanford, like other academic medical centers, is a nonprofit institution, has a tripartite mission of teaching healthcare and research. So the exception, and what we try to encourage venture capital backed firms and other companies that might have an idea, is to say, well, if there's a substantial nexus between your product or service and AI, can you make is there some kind of a joint academic purpose? Are you going to make the data openly available? These kinds of factors, like Jason's amazing work with Nigam Shah and others, if it's an openly available resource that's going to benefit the public at large, institutions are going to be much more comfortable in making that determination. Some other factors that are involved are: do you have privacy and security mechanisms to do audit and logging? Have you invested in privacy and security, or is it just an afterthought? You can really tell when someone makes a pitch or demonstrates their due diligence processes whether they're up to snuff or not. So those are some of the two that are top of mind. I can go into a few other factors. I think, do you have good processes for handling your third-party risk? I mean, a lot of people say, oh, we're just gonna have the data, but have you really thought about your other data partners, other vendors, people who might have access or touch the data? Because a lot of people don't think about data from a life cycle perspective. They just think about the data in a certain state and don't think about all the different parties that might have access. So to see that kind of planning will give institutions much more comfort that their data is going to be handled consistent with their mission, their values, and their regulatory, ethical, and legal responsibilities.
Excellent. So we're here at a pediatric and maternal innovation showcase. I'm curious now what your thoughts are about the unique implications in pediatric and maternal care for the release of data. This question is to both of you, but I guess, Jason, were there learnings or additional hurdles that were applied to the pediatric and maternal data? And then for Scott, are there additional considerations around the release of pediatric and maternal data? We'll go Jason first.
Actually, I'd say start with Scott, because I think it's a governance question principally, and that really materially impacts what happens on the data side. So,
Yeah. So I would say that there's interesting privacy issues that come up with pediatric data, just in the sense that, especially in the neonatal context, where the data is just inextricably commingled with the mother, because the mother is giving birth to the child. And most of the privacy regimes that have developed over the years posit an individual who has autonomous choice. And it doesn't really, account for some of these things. So when people create unstructured data, and a lot of AI is based on these models and tokenization and other aspects of the data, it's hard to disentangle. So it's an interesting problem that I don't have like a quick answer for you today, but it's an interesting issue. So what generally happens on a practical level from an institution is just to rely on any kind of existing mechanisms for authorization for minors or natal. So in a lot of leading pediatric hospitals, whether it's Cincinnati Children's, CHOP, Boston Children's, or here at Stanford, we rely on the state law mechanisms for granting authorization, and just rely on those mechanisms where if the data is available for use in research generally, and then it can be, in the pediatric context, then it can be used for research. And I think that the authorization is usually a state law matter. So that's how we always encourage people to say, okay, go to the IRB. That's like one of your first stops. Just consult with them, even if there's not federally funded mandates to consult with the IRB. That's kind of one of your first stops, and then we'll sort of take it from there.
Just to build on that, I mean, the case that we made for, there are pediatric patients in Medline. Medline is a small data set of 254 longitudinal timelines, so there's a handful of less than 20 pediatric patients. But the argument that we forwarded and we talked to the IRB is that it's we really want to be representative when evaluating the performance of an LLM. And so it's important to not systematically exclude a population because that actually implies its own set of potential harms. So there's a very, I think, in my mind, compelling argument for being representative in your data set in a world where we imagine using these models over everybody.
I really like that point of focusing on the harm of exclusion. I think it's really easy for us to get nervous about additional regulatory risks, requirements around pediatric data and sort of stop the discussion there. But I really appreciate the effort that you guys put in to sort of push this through to include pediatrics to get this data released. You mentioned sort of the value of these data sets in evaluating AI, and I think we heard from panels earlier today about the limited ability to develop and validate AI algorithms in pediatrics because it is so hard to get meaningful data, and so potentially making this type of stuff available at the very least brings into the conversation that algorithms should be evaluated on data. It's also interesting to think about the role that easily accessible data has in coaxing researchers or early career scientists, undergrads, to study specific diseases. I think when kind of early career data scientists start building models, one of the first things they can do is download the MIMIC data set and build sepsis prediction models. You can imagine a similar scenario with pediatric diseases, where if pediatric disease data is easily accessible, people start to use that data early on, and you can sort of see that as a pipeline for developing professional interest in addressing pediatric diseases. So I think we have, and of course, there's sort of the pediatric argument that pediatric institutions have to work together better than other adult institutions to get the same results. So thinking about sharing resources, sharing data, we have smaller numbers, we have sort of more rare diseases, and what ways can we coordinate and pool our resources to overcome those barriers. So I have one final question, and then I want to be able to open it up to the audience. But what are your thoughts about what could be done differently or what needs to change in order to encourage more release of pediatric EHR data, either here at Stanford or at other institutions?
I'm a big believer in a proof by prototype. I think Mimic and the PhysioNet folks have done just an amazing job. I mean, truly transforming the space of healthcare AI by showing that you can have this amazing, rich data set released in a safe way that does not compromise, patient sort of privacy and risk. And we've have, at least over a decade plus of track record there. And to Keith's really excellent point, I mean, the research community points a light to where they can easily get data. And the more friction and barriers you introduce, the more harms that manifest from that. And so I think imagining systems that are easier for researchers to gain access to look at data is paramount if you want to capitalize on all of the capacity for innovation. And I think there are interesting different models. We did the Mimic model where you sign up and verify your identity and download the data. But there are other models too, like All of Us, which has sort of a authenticated access to a cloud instance of data. I think there are lots of interesting paradigms for making data available at scale while putting reasonable safeguards that people can buy into. So I think we really need to think about, ambitious efforts like that that can potentially span, institutions and countries even. So.
Yeah, I think that's all excellent points. I would just add that we need to make the case that open data supports so many national objectives, like not only reproducibility and innovation and healthcare, but in order to have good privacy and security, you need open data. In order to have the nation be leaders in AI, we need to validate these results with very, very sophisticated statistical models. And those models are useless unless you have data sets to compare them with. And to the extent that Stanford can be leaders in that, or our peers want to create these benchmark data sets to advance these interests, we're going to be in a better place than we are right now.
I think it's also worthwhile thinking about how this stuff gets paid for. I mean, we obviously more funding makes most problems easier, but particularly in a research realm, it is hard to justify the costs and the effort that it takes to release these data sets with a single researcher or a single lab or a single grant. I suspect Jason can attest that this is sort of a whole lot more effort went into this than any grant was able to support. So how can institutions set up funding mechanisms that allow this type of thing, because the effort is substantial and the benefit is almost exclusively outside of the organization. So how do we sort of recognize that as valuable and support it? All right, we have time for a couple of questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you. We heard you talk a little bit about the existential nature of pediatric data to AI and some of the disincentives that pediatric centers have for the sharing of the data. I'm wondering if you can comment on federated learning as a solution. And you may have mentioned one of the brand names. I don't know if that's using the federated learning model, but then more generally, do you have any sense that the FDA or any regulatory bodies are thinking about this problem and potentially would be thinking about solutions sort of along the lines of a PDC, but to try and solve the pediatric data issue?
Yeah, sure. So, no, it's a great question. So federated learning and actually federated technical structures are outstanding methods to do governance. I think in an earlier talk, someone said, the old model was central databases, whereas transfers. But to the extent that we can keep the data at the source and distribute queries to or do different kinds of federated learning, that can actually cut a lot of the administrative burden that is often attached to building some of these data sets. So I would definitely affirm federated learning as one means of many different technical architectural means to achieve really good data governance. On the FDA front, it's interesting. I actually have a meeting with Jeffrey Brown from the FDA in next week on some interesting topics. It's interesting that the FDA Sentinel project uses a platform called Trinetics to look at some of the post-market surveillance issues. And that's a data governance platform that utilizes different data sets and different technologies to monitor products. So I think it's fascinating about how the FDA is looking at real-world evidence and different kinds of technical means to validate results that depart from its traditional means. So it's something worth watching. I don't have a detailed answer for you, but the FDA is definitely looking at these advanced computational methods.
One drawback of the federated approach is that it needs every institution to have their data in a similar schema or a similar format. Like if you want to sort of move the AI algorithm, it has to land at a place that is the same as where it was developed. And that in itself is a massive amount of work. So Stanford puts a lot of effort into developing our EHR data into the OMOP format. And that in theory enables that type of federated learning. But it still has its challenges, and even after we put a lot of effort into making that happen. So I think it's an approach, but not necessarily an easier one.
Yeah, just to chime in on that angle, I think federated learning is one technical solution with the limitations that Keith just enumerated. So I really think the future is strategies that are both local, so your data preserves governance, but then addresses this sort of thorny, extreme cost of formatting your data to be shovel-ready for federated learning. And I'm a big believer that there is new technology operations with Gen AI to sort of handle that kind of last mile component that preserves governance and lets you learn and share data or share insights across institutions. And I think that's firmly sort of research questions, but yeah.
One thing I would also add is that in addition to the ontologies that are being built for different types of sets, there's also this push, and I think it's legitimate, is to create an ecosystem of persistent identifiers like around the data sets. And I think that's going to help some of the governance pieces. I'm not sure if it will totally solve, it might not address some of the automated analysis that would be much more easy with a robust ontology, but it still is going to help you manage the data and give you the approvals that will enable access.
Thank you. So this is not just a Stanford question. It's actually more like in the global health space. I think besides Mimic, there is no longitudinal EHR data set that's from a global health perspective. That's for the rest of the world, basically. And so I think I was talking to a group at WHO, at the IFC World Bank, who are thinking about funding this for other countries. And I think two key questions came up about how you've been able to do this. First of all, is the issue of patient consent, and then the identification. Does getting patient consent solve the problem of having to de-identify thoroughly and completely, or does solving the obfuscation, just the DID side of things, does it then absolve you from trying to reach every single patient? For example, I think you said Medline had 124 patients. Did we have to reach out to each person, and does that absolve you of extremely accurate DID, which is maybe not possible right now?
I can take that one. Yeah. So I think in the past, de-identification was, people almost treated like a get-out-of-jail-free card. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think if any kind of data is developed from human beings, there's this idea of controlled access. If something is already public, it's actually, you don't need controlled access. But there's this ethical responsibility if you have data from human beings that you have some kind of controls around it. So to the global issue, like there's some interesting domain-specific efforts like GA4GH, the Global Alliance for Global Health, that is trying to make data accessible throughout the world, and are funding efforts in Africa, Latin America, and in Asia to improve those processes. But consent isn't the only reason. Like there are legitimate reasons where consent is not really viable because you have millions of data. So it's important to have an ethics review board that looks at objective reasons, not just subjective aspects of privacy, but to see what would work in the global public interest, but take into account stakeholders and those interests. So it's a complex answer, but I don't think consent alone is going to justify it. And DID is not a magic bullet either.
Wonderful. Well, Jason and Scott, thank you both for the effort that you put in to make data publicly available for the research community and for your participation with us today. Thank you all.
Thank you.